Amen. All right. Well, Ruth chapter 4 is where we're going to be tonight. And just by way kind of update, I'm hoping to get through Ruth chapter 4 tonight. I think there's a really good chance of that, at which point we're still going to be meeting next week. What we'll be doing next week, I'm not sure yet. We can even take some suggestions at the end if you have something that you'd like to cover just in a 1-week span. But next week will be our last week for the summer. And then we'll take a break in the summer and plan on coming back on the other side of the school year. And I have absolutely no ideas. I literally have not even thought about what we'll be doing at that point. And so if you have any suggestions for that, I'd be all ears, and I'd love to know what you feel like would be beneficial and helpful. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end to talk about that tonight. But let's get into Ruth chapter 4. As we've come to Ruth chapter 4, of course, we've been following the story all the way along, and we made this claim, right, that the primary character in the book of Ruth is actually not really Ruth, it's Naomi. And we see that in the very beginning when we see the description that Naomi went with her husband Elimelech, her sons Mahlon and Chilion. They went to the land of Moab because there was a famine in Israel. And as they went, there was tragedy that struck, right? Elimelech died, her 2 children died, she was left empty, and eventually she comes back to Israel and she says her life is too bitter, so that she says, "Call me Mara." She literally changes her own name and says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." But of course, the story of Ruth is that Ruth decided to come with her. She clung to Naomi. She swore by God. She said, "May nothing but death separate you and me. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you dwell, I'll dwell. Where you're buried, I'll be buried." And Ruth really abandoned her former identity, her former life, in order to cling to Naomi. Now, something we've talked about over and over, it's going to come up again in chapter 4, is that the book of Ruth intentionally just puts it right in front of our faces that Ruth is Ruth the Moabitess. Ruth the Moabitess. It's how people saw her, and it's how they inevitably saw her. She was a Moabite, which meant she was considered to be an outsider, an enemy of the people of God. And yet, through her faithfulness to Naomi, she was someone who was seen, as Boaz told us in chapter 3, right? She was seen as a noble woman. A woman who gained and earned the respect of the people. But as we go through Ruth, right, we see these coincidences. We see that they just happened to return to Israel during the time of the barley harvest. She just happened to go to the field of Boaz. We see that as she went to the field of Boaz, Boaz took notice of her, and we saw that Boaz showed his character in the way that he treated Ruth over and against even the way that his chief servant saw her. You remember in chapter 2 where he asks, "Whose young woman is this?" And the person responds, "She is a Moabite woman from the territory of Moab." But we said it's really amazing because Boaz, if we take the genealogy of Matthew 1 seriously, Boaz was someone who knew what it was like to see a woman who wanted to be grafted into the people of Israel, wanted to be part of the people of God, but likely faced a stigma. Why? Because according to Matthew chapter 1, Boaz's mother was Rahab. And he sees this woman Ruth, and he treats her with dignity, honor. Even though she describes herself as less than your female servants, he places her at the table. He serves her himself. He shows her incredible honor, incredible care, and he actually prays, "May you be blessed, and may you receive a full reward for the faithfulness that you've shown." And then in chapter 3, this is the one of the most fun chapters, at least in my opinion, in all of Scripture, because in chapter 3, we fast forward, the barley harvest is almost over. Ruth and Naomi now have to figure out what are they going to do, and Naomi comes up with a plan, right? She says to Naomi, "Take off your clothes of mourning," right? "Put on your best outfit. Go wash up. Go put perfume on. Go to the threshing floor whenever Boaz is in a good mood. Uncover his feet. Go and do whatever he tells you to do." And of course, Ruth does that and even more. Ruth was an incredibly bold woman. She goes in the middle of the night, she uncovers his feet, and she proposes. There's really not any other way to describe it. She proposes to Boaz and says essentially, "Hey, you remember what you just said the other day whenever I was at the table and you prayed that God would bless me and take care of me? Why don't you, Boaz, be the answer to your own prayer and cover your wing over me?" And Boaz is startled. But I think there's at least an indication that he's been thinking about this, because in the middle of the night, he wakes up and he says, okay, you have shown more kindness to me in this, but he says, there's another Redeemer who is closer in kinship than I am. In other words, Boaz says, Ruth, I want you to be taken care of. I want you to be treated with honor. But in order for that to happen, we have to go through all of the proper channels. And this is what I want to impress upon you as we come to Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4 is not just the story of Boaz redeeming Ruth. It's also important to know how he does it in order for Ruth to receive the full legitimacy of a woman of Israel. How Boaz does what he is about to do is just as important as the fact that he does what he's about to do. Remember, on the threshing floor, it pushed it to the point of scandal. But now Boaz says, Ruth, I will do everything in my power to protect you and redeem you. But we want to do this in a way that honors God and a way that honors man. And we're going to look at that as we come to chapter 4. Of course, where do we end it? Ruth goes back to Naomi, and Naomi on pins and needles says, what happened? What happened? Tell me. And Ruth tells her, and of course, Ruth also went back loaded and as a down payment, right, that Boaz said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. She doesn't, and now Naomi says, wait, because he will not rest until the matter is settled. And so we come to chapter 4 to see how Boaz is going to settle the matter. So let's read it. Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. So Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. And soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. And Boaz said, come over here and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Now, a few things to note. The city gate was the place of business. It was the place of transactions. And think about this. In a town like Bethlehem, and really in any town in the ancient Near East, there wasn't internet. There wasn't, online contracts. If you wanted to ratify something legally and you wanted to make sure that everyone knew about it, you had to perform that transaction in a public way, in a public place where people could see and people could recognize what you did. And so the city gate was a place for that to happen. Also, just from a practical standpoint, the city gate was likely a place that was somewhat guarded as well as somewhat shaded. It was also located at the front of the city, which meant it was a place where people were passing by. So it was a convenient place, both because of its environment, because of its shade, because it was a place that people came. It was a busy hub, and therefore it was a prime place for these kinds of things to happen. So Boaz gets up, and he immediately goes to the city gate. And he looks for this kinsman redeemer. Now, you may notice here that the name of the kinsman redeemer is left out. We're going to talk about that in a second. But it says that the man he had spoken about just happened to come by. And again, we see another one of those coincidences, right? That come throughout the book of Ruth, that the man just happened to be coming by. And so what does Boaz say? He says, all right, I need you to come over. I need you to sit down. We've got some business to take care of. You take a seat. And then he also goes, and it says in verse 2, he went and found the elders of the town, 10 men of the town's elders, and he said, you sit here. Now, 10 elders was a number that was significant because that's necessary for a business transaction and for witnesses who are willing to ratify and say, yes, this has taken place. And just to say it again, they didn't have a recorder of deeds, right? They didn't have a courthouse. They didn't have a place where you could go. They didn't have the online app where you can literally look at the GPS and see everyone who owns every parcel of land anywhere, right? They had none of this. So in order for business transactions to happen and for everyone to recognize their legitimacy, they had to have a certain number of elders who were there who could look at it and say, yes, we were all here. We all saw it. Everyone's on the same page. This is all above board. So he finds these 10 men who can function as witnesses, but there's also another function. It's not just the business side of this. Because they're dealing with the redemption of a dead man's name as well as dealing with the marriage of a foreign woman, these elders are representing not just, okay, we're ratifying a business transaction, they're also going to represent the legitimacy of bringing a foreigner into their community. In other words, the social and the community dynamic of this chapter is crucial. It's one thing if Boaz brings in a foreigner, marries her, okay, well, that guy's crazy, he can do whatever he wants. But it's another thing for the community as a whole to place their stamp of approval and their stamp of legitimacy on the marriage between Boaz and Ruth. Boaz knows that even if he were to redeem her, that doesn't mean that she's going to be fully accepted. He knows that even if he marries her, that doesn't mean that she, or think of this, or her offspring are going to be fully included in the community. He doesn't just need the kinsman redeemer's approval. He is also seeking the full inclusion of Ruth the Moabite into the community of Israelites. And that's going to be key. We're going to see it as we keep going. But let's talk about this name real quick. So you have the kinsman redeemer, and he intentionally is not named. In fact, he is given a false name. And in Hebrew, it's really funny, and it's meant to be funny. It's the name Poloni Almoni. And Poloni Almoni is a way of saying this person who shall not be named. You know, it's kind of like Voldemort I won't even say that, all right? If you know, you know. If you don't need to, okay? But he who shall not be named, okay? And there's a reason for this. You ever, I think it was the movie or the show Dragnet. You remember this? Right, the TV show Dragnet, where at the beginning it says these are not corresponding to real life people and the names have been changed to protect the innocent. You remember that line? Well, in this case, it seems the opposite. The name is changed to protect the guilty. Because how would you like to go down in history as the fool who gave up your right and opportunity to marry Ruth? And so, literally, the name is Mr. So-and-so came by. They don't name him, but they change the name to essentially, in maybe some way, protect his shame. But also, think about this. There's an incredible irony here. By the way, me and my buddy Brian Koning, we do an Old Testament podcast where we just went through Ruth. So Brian said this in the podcast, and I thought he was right, so I'm going to give him credit for it. Here's what he said. He said there's an irony, and he said it's really a poetic slam that he's going to refuse to marry Ruth. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But Mr. So-and-so is going to refuse to marry Ruth. Why? To protect his inheritance and preserve his name. Isn't there a poetic justice that his very reasoning of protecting his inheritance is actually what ends up costing him having any kind of recognition at all? We don't know this guy's name. He's literally referred to as Mr. So-and-so. But in verse 3, it says this: he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you don't want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And he replies, I want to redeem it. Okay? Now, this makes sense, basically from every standpoint. And Boaz is intentional here. Boaz is very shrewd, because he's going to put all of the pros up front, and he's going to keep his ace behind his back. What's going on here? Well, Naomi has apparently the right to a portion of the field that had belonged to Elimelech. Now, we might be thinking, well, if she had this portion of the field, then why wasn't she doing anything with it beforehand? Why wasn't she trying to work the field in order to make it profitable? And there are multiple answers to that. One answer is, remember, they came at the beginning of the barley harvest. You can't come at the beginning of the harvest and harvest anything. You have to have already worked it. But also, even though she might have had the right to that piece of land, that doesn't mean that she, an older woman, or Ruth would have had the ability to farm it. So there's an issue of timing. There's also the issue of just the financial ability to have worked the piece of land. But Elimelech apparently still owned it, and Naomi had the rights to it, at which point you can understand the prospect. Free real estate. Hey, if I redeem this land, it's nothing but pros. I get to work it. I get to make more money. And at this point, he doesn't know anything about Ruth. He doesn't know anything about the responsibility. So all he knows is, I just get a free plot of land. And guess what? That's good news for me. Of course I want to redeem it. No brainer. But this is where Boaz craftily then pulls out of his right hand. He says then in verse 5, on the day that you redeem it, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess. And notice, Boaz puts it right up front. You will acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property. And at this point, the man's tune immediately changes. The Redeemer replied, I can't redeem it myself or I will ruin my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption because I can't redeem it. Well, what's going on here? Multiple things could be going on at the same time. We don't know exactly, and the text doesn't explain it, but at least there's a few things that are very possible. The first is he now recognizes that it's not just profit. He's going to have to include two more mouths in his household. He's going to have to feed Naomi, take care of her. He's also going to have to take care of Ruth. So if the profit doesn't come until next season, whenever at the very soonest I'd be able to work the land and then turn the profit, he's got a whole year of feeding someone and taking care of someone with nothing to show for it. But it's even more than that. The fact is, he now is going to have an obligation to marry Ruth, which means take care of her for the rest of his life, as well as take care of any children. So now this is adding a major responsibility to him, a major expense, on top of which is the thought that, hold on, did you say Ruth the Moabitess? Did I hear you correctly? Do I want to risk my social standing, my social status, my inheritance, and my place by marrying this woman who, again, let's all remember, is part of a people who, remember in the book of Numbers, right? The Moabite women were seductresses who led people away from God. Do you remember the stories of the Moabites who were enemies of God, even in the period of the Judges? This man instantly, as soon as he hears Ruth the Moabite, as soon as he hears of the extra responsibilities, as soon as he realizes that doing this could actually lead to him, in his own mind at least, to him not having as much for his own family and to spend for his own needs, he says, no, I can't do it. If it's about the profit, sure, I'll take the profit. But to redeem Ruth and take her as my wife, no go. I'm not there. And so he immediately changes his mind, which is, of course, exactly what Boaz wanted him to do in the first place, right? Here's the profit, but no, do you really want Ruth the Moabite? Because you have to take her as part of the deal. He says, no, I can't do it. And it's at this point in verse 7 that we have this really interesting turn, where it says in verse 7, and this is like a narrative aside, right? This is where the narrator comes in and has to explain something. Let's look at it. At an earlier period in Israel, a man removed his sandal and gave it to the other party in order to make any matter legally binding concerning the right of redemption or the exchange of property. This was the method of legally binding a transaction in Israel. Very fascinating. This actually gives us some information that's important. This shows us that whenever the book of Ruth was written, it had to have been quite a long time between the events of the book and the writing of the book. You see that? That apparently the events of the book had happened so long in the past that the narrator actually had to say, okay, this weird thing is about to happen that doesn't really make sense, but I just want you to know it was common at the time. We do this, right? It's kind of like if I'm not recommending this, but just to give you an example, like if you ever seen the musical Hamilton, they've got the 10 dual commandments in the musical Hamilton. It's just a song in the show. And what is it meant to do? It's meant to inform us about something that's like, okay, we might know, yeah, people dueled in the past, but what were some of the things they did and how did it work? It's meant to remind us of something that was common in the past, but we've forgotten about now. Well, the same thing is true. This was a common practice, but whether it was 100 years or 200 years or more after this had happened, we don't know. What do we know? We're going to get this in a minute. It was obviously after the time of David, possibly the time of Solomon. So we're talking at earliest 150, 200 years. But some people think it was even later. Some people think it was even the time of Ezra. So it might have been like 400 years. We don't know. The fact is we don't know. But what we do know is the narrator felt the need to explain this. Now, that raises the question, what on earth does it mean? And we read in verse 8, it says, so the Redeemer removed his sandal and said to Boaz, buy back the property yourself. And Lance, I believe that you asked this last week or a couple weeks ago when we were here. What does it mean? Why would they have exchanged sandals? And this is where I could give you some ideas, but we have no idea. No one has any clue. And by the way, there's no other example of this. A lot of times in the Bible, there are customs that the Israelites do that other cultures kind of do as well. And so we can kind of peek on the other cultures and say, well, they seem to do it for these reasons, and therefore the Israelites might have had similar reasons. There's no other example of this that we're aware of or that scholars have uncovered, there's no other parallel. Now, let me give you some ideas that are going to quickly fall apart. Okay, you wear sandals. If you literally exchange the sandal, then that is in a sense a visual collateral, right? That if we exchange shoes and I now wear your shoe or I now have your shoe, this is kind of like a copy of your contract, right? This is something that you have, and it's something that a sandal is valuable, right? And it's valuable enough to be important. It's identifiable enough to be identifiable. But it's also something that you could exchange, and it means something, but it's not going to like break the bank of either one of them. But there's also, right, that visible element to it. I have your sandal. It's proof that this transaction took place. There is a moment, you give me your sandal, I give you my sandal. That means the transaction has taken place. We do a handshake today, right? We don't really do a handshake. If you actually do a transaction, you sign 10 times on a dotted line so that no one can sue anyone else. And then you flip the page and you sign 10 more times on the next page, right, just to make sure. But in their case, there is no signing on the bottom line. Are you serious enough? You know, for kids, right, it's a pinky promise. Oh, if you do the pinky promise, that's a big deal. Well, for grown men, it was apparently, are you willing to put your sandal on the line, right? Are you serious? We don't know. I mean, that's all guesswork. That's all speculation. But in any case, that's what they did. And we see that this man, the Redeemer, removed his sandal and said to Boaz, buy back the property yourself. Now again, that man just had in his mind the property. He didn't care about the woman. And in that sense, don't forget, this was a time, in the time of the judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. He was thinking of himself. Boaz was thinking about the woman. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because now, Boaz is about to publicly take on Ruth as his wife. And please hear me, the public element of this is incredibly important. What does he say? Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion and Mahlon. And I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess. And by the way, again, Boaz did not try to hide the fact that she was a Moabitess. Why? Because if he tried to hide that or diminish it, then what could people have come and said? They could have come and said, well, you know, you failed to mention that whenever we were there and you asked us to give our approval. You kind of just hid that. You tucked it away because you didn't want us to know. No, Boaz said, I want everybody to know. So we're all on the same page. Can we all agree she's a Moabitess? Yes, we can all agree that she's a Moabitess. Can we all agree that she's a widow? By the way, I forgot to mention this. Another reason why Mr. So-and-so might not have wanted to redeem Ruth is because, and we said this before, she had been married 10 years to Mahlon and she had been childless. At which point, he could have potentially run the risk of having a wife who was totally barren, at which point there is no advantage to that at all. He has a wife that he has to take care of. She gives no honor to him. He gets nothing in return. So it's very possible that ran him off as well. But now, Boaz says, Ruth the Moabitess, I want you all to know, on this day I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess as my wife to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. Now, please understand, this is an act of showing honor to the dead. And in an honor and a shame culture, this was an act that showed Boaz's true colors. It showed his character. Because he was essentially saying, okay, I'm not doing this to do any favors for myself. Yes, there's risk involved. Yes, this woman is a Moabitess. But in order to honor those who are deceased, and in order to continue their family name, I am going to acquire her as my wife, and I'm going to assume the risk that's involved. I understand what I'm doing. I understand who she is, and I want you to be witnesses today that Ruth is now going to become my wife. And he says this, you are witnesses today. By the way, Boaz implicitly here is making an argument. Because in an honor and a shame culture, it wasn't just about the honor and the shame of the individual, it was about the honor and the shame of the community as a whole. Notice how he describes it. he says, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. Do you see that corporate element? That essentially Boaz is saying, I will assume the risk, but if we do this right, it's going to boost all of our honor. Because we are going to have continued the dead man's name. We're going to reap the benefit. If we do it right, we're going to reap the benefit of having his field cultivated. That helps us all. At which point, everyone wins. And now the question is, what are the elders going to say about this? And please, again, don't miss this. We are so used to knowing the end of the story that we forget that this was a huge deal. This was a pivotal moment. Again, it's one thing for Boaz to marry Ruth. It's another thing for her to be fully accepted and included in this community. But what do we see? We see the response. It says, and all the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. They are willing to be witnesses, not only of the transaction itself, but as we're going to see, they're going to provide a blessing. Now, I've made the argument throughout that when we look at the book of Ruth, there are blessings and prayers that all come to fruition within the book itself. You may remember the very first prayer, right, was Naomi in chapter 1 saying, may each of you, saying to Ruth and Orpah, may each of you find rest in the home of a husband. We now see that come to fruition. She is about to be redeemed. She is about to find rest in the home of a husband. We see in chapter 2, we see Boaz pray, may the Lord give you a full reward under the God for whom you have come for refuge. May he cover you with his wing. And what do we see? That in this moment, she comes to Boaz, and Boaz becomes the answer to his own prayer. But now, here's what's so interesting. We're going to see 3 more blessings that the elders are going to give. 3 more blessings, one for Ruth. Look at what it says in verse 11. We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. So that's Ruth's blessing. And notice this. They are saying, may Ruth, we all know Ruth the Moabitess, may she be like the mothers of Israel. We are embracing her, we are accepting her, and we are invoking the blessing of God to change her identity so that no longer will she be considered Ruth the Moabitess, but now she can be Ruth, a mother of Israel. May God bless her like Rachel and Leah. And of course, Rachel and Leah were the mothers, 2 of the mothers of the 12 patriarchs. They were Jacob's wives, and they were the mothers of at least some of the men who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. In particular, they say that they built together the house of Israel. And then, after blessing Ruth, they then bless Boaz. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and may your name be well known in Bethlehem. They're praying that Boaz will have a great name and have a great reputation. May your name be great, and may you be seen as powerful. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if this is true, but I'm playing with this idea. So if you think it's good, then great. If not, then I can just be wrong. But someone actually asked, they asked a couple of weeks ago, why is it that if the whole idea of levirate marriage and Boaz taking on Ruth as his wife was perpetuating the name of Mahlon and Elimelech, then why is it that Boaz is the one whose name is remembered? Why wouldn't it be Mahlon and Elimelech? Why would it be Boaz? At which point, I don't have any better explanation than to say that's what the elders prayed for, right? May your name be well known in Bethlehem. His name shows up, so maybe that's the answer. I don't know, but in any case, right, Boaz is one of the most famous men in the history of Bethlehem. So Boaz receives this blessing. In verse 12, they then bless the offspring. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now here's what's fascinating, and we've mentioned this before. The story of Tamar and Judah is a story that makes you blush, right? And if you haven't read it, it's in Genesis chapter 38, right? And it's the story of Judah, who had 3 sons. The first son was married to this woman named Tamar. The first son dies. The next son is supposed to take up the responsibility of levirate marriage, right? He goes and literally during the time that he is supposed to procreate and provide conception, he does not do so, and he doesn't do so in a dastardly way, and God literally says, I am displeased with what you did, and he kills him. At which point, Judah has a third son, and what is Judah's responsibility as the father? His responsibility is to make sure that third son continues the family line, but Judah withholds his son. Tamar finds out about it, at which point, what does Tamar do? She dresses herself up as a prostitute. She waits along the way until she sees Judah coming down the road. Judah goes in. He thinks she's a prostitute. She sleeps with Judah. She takes as a token of payment his staff, his signet ring, these things that identify him. And then at that point, he leaves. He says, I'm going to send my payment to you later, and then you can send my stuff back with me. She becomes pregnant. Judah finds out. Judah wants to kill her. He comes to kill her, at which point she says, this baby belongs to the man who owns these. And what does Judah say? He says of her, she is more righteous than I. That is the conception story of our beloved Perez, who's mentioned here in the text. And by the way, not just mentioned here, when we get to the genealogy at the end, who does it begin with? Perez. Now, why would they have, this would be, in other words, this would be a very strange episode in your family history to invoke as a blessing. But here's what I think is going on. The elders here are not naive. Like, they recognize that sometimes weird things happen in this world. And they also recognize that God can use those very strange things to bring about his ends. And so they say, listen, God accepted Tamar, and there's a lot of worms to unpack. Wait a second, was what Tamar did right? Well, there's a lot of questions there, but think about this. Did God allow her to conceive? Yes. Did God vindicate her? Well, if you read Matthew chapter 1, there's a name that shows up. At which point, it's messy, but it's there. But what does it say? May your house become like the house of Perez, the son Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now again, this was particularly appropriate for the people of Bethlehem, because the people of Bethlehem were from what tribe? The tribe of Judah. At which point, many of them would have looked back at their family tree, and they would have seen the name what? Perez, the son that Tamar bore to Judah. And they bless the offspring that is going to, notice what they say. This is important. Because the offspring, the Lord will give you by this woman. God is going to give you offspring by this woman. So you see here tiers of inclusion, tiers of legitimacy. Not T-E-A-R-S, T-I-E-R-S, tiers. Like, the community is now accepting Ruth. May God bless you, but the ultimate question is going to be, does God give his stamp of approval to Ruth? Does God include her and graft her in? And what do we see? Please, I want you to see the connection point. They bless Ruth, they bless Boaz, they bless their offspring. In the very next verse, it says in verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her. And she gave birth to a son. Think about this. For 10 years she was married, no child. Blessing. May the Lord grant conception, and may the Lord bless your children. And after that blessing, instantly fulfillment. And this is why I really believe in the book of Ruth, these blessings are meant to be narrative vehicles, right? And this is, there will be 5 people maybe in the room who appreciate this, and maybe they won't, I don't know. But I love this. I don't know. This is the way my mind works. Anyone ever play like Mario Kart racing? Where you go on you're driving and then you hit the speed skids that power you up and make you go faster, right? That's kind of what prayer is in this book. When you hear a blessing, You're meant to see, how is this going to be fulfilled? How is this going to come about? How is this going to speed the narrative along to its final destination, to its finish line? And that's what these prayers do. May the Lord bless Ruth. Does God bless Ruth? Yes. May the Lord make your name great. Is Boaz's name great? It's going to be in the genealogy of Kings in just a minute. Is God going to bless her offspring? Yes. God is going to bless her offspring. And so the Lord grants conception to her. Then in verse 14, the women. Now this is fascinating. Again, actually there's a thought that literally just crossed my mind. And I don't know if this is good either, but I'll share it with you. Who are the elders? They're all men, right? But now the women, and by the way, this is a bookend at the beginning of the book of Ruth. What do you have? You have Naomi come, and the women are the ones who look at Naomi, and it's the women who say, could this possibly be Naomi? Same women who now, on the other side of the story, they come back, and it says, the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family redeemer today. They recognize this is the Lord's hand all the way along. All of these coincidences, all of these things, your thought was that God's hand had turned against you and that your life was bitter. But in fact, God was working all these things out for your good as part of His plan. May the Lord be blessed who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May His name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. These women, and again, think about this. These women bless Ruth, right? She's better to you than 7 sons. Your sons are full Israelites. But after all, I mean, sort of implicit in this is your husband and your sons, they were kind of duds. They did leave us all. They did go to the fields of Moab. Like, Ruth the Moabite is better than your sons. Let's all be honest. I mean, I'm stretching that too far. But you know what I'm saying? They say, Ruth, she's good. She's one of us. But here's what I want you to see. It's one thing for Ruth to be accepted, but it's another thing entirely for her son to be accepted. And here, the women of Bethlehem are saying, your son, Ruth, is a blessing. Your son, in other words, there's no tarnish for your son. There's no stigma for your son. He's one of us. And it's one thing for the elders to say that. It's another thing for the women to say that. In fact, we're going to even get closer. Look at what it says. We're going to come back to that, better to you than 7 sons. But it says, Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became his nanny. And in verse 17, this is incredibly unusual. It says, the neighbor women said, so you have the women generally, but now you have the neighbor women, the close women. They said, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, this is the only instance I'm familiar with in all of Scripture where someone besides the parents names the child. And think of this. You say, well, what about like Gabriel coming to Mary and saying his name should be called Jesus? Guess what? Mary and Joseph still got to name him. But in this instance, it says the women named Obed. And I think this, if you were to think, what is the absolute fullest sense in which someone can be included in a community, it would be that community providing the name for that person. There is no question at all that Obed is a child of God, that he's an Israelite child. His mother may be Moabite. Heck, his grandmother may be Rahab the prostitute. But this one is one of us. And it's almost like, and this is a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but it's almost like, hey, if anyone questions him, you mess with him, you mess with us. He's Obed. He's one of us. This is the community embracing Ruth. By the way, that's the idea. She's better to you than 7 sons. That's a huge statement because sons were incredibly prized. But what does it say? Why does it say she's better to you than 7 sons? Because it says, your daughter-in-law who loves you, that her love for you, that her faithfulness to you, the fact that she didn't depart from you, she didn't leave you, she gave up everything. Of course, Ruth makes good on her vow, right? I'm going to stay with you to the end. And the people of Bethlehem, the women of Bethlehem, they recognize that and says, she's better than 7 sons because she loves you and she put you first. But it says that Naomi became his nanny. She's the primary caregiver. And it says, the neighbor women said, a son's been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. Obed, by the way, could be another form of servant, which is very fascinating in and of itself. But he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And this is sort of the big reveal at the end, right? Wow. This story isn't truly about Ruth at all. It's not even about Naomi. It's all to get us ahead to tell us David's origins. That Ruth is the great-grandmother of a king. That Obed fathers Jesse, and Jesse fathers David. And that David, of course, is the greatest king in the history of Israel. That's, he has his ups and downs. But he is the model, right? He is the model of what kingship looks like. And this is where speculation runs wild. Why is this? And why is this included? Well, it could be, this is what some people think, and I think this is plausible. Some people think that David had sort of this dirty secret in his closet. Hey, have you heard that David's got Moabite blood? In fact, just to sharpen this a little bit, if David's great-grandmother was a Moabite, that means that he was 1/8 ethnically Moabite, right? If you just do the math, that means he's 1/8 ethnically Moabite. And if you think about that for a minute, that actually has significance even in American history. Many of you guys have heard of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And I've shared this with you before, that in Plessy versus Ferguson, basically, that's right. Yes, all right, thank you, Taylor. All right. That in Plessy versus Ferguson, I think it was like the late 1800s, there was a man who was ethnically 1/8 black and 7/8 Caucasian. And yet there was a law that basically stipulated that if you were black, you couldn't ride in the certain rail cars, and the rail company basically said, you're not allowed to do this. He challenged it, and he said, nope, I'm 7/8 Caucasian, therefore I'm good. They challenge it. They tell him to move. He doesn't move. They take it all the way to the Supreme Court, and Plessy versus Ferguson essentially sort of laid the legal groundwork for what became Jim Crow and that eventually led to the Civil Rights era. But the point is, think about this, that in one of the most decisive cases in Supreme Court history, he had the same amount of black ethnicity as David had Moabite ethnicity. And in a sense, okay, well, that's just kind of a factoid, but it really does show us. In America in 1890s, 1/8 meant that's who you were. Well, if you're David's political enemies, and we know that David had political enemies, the fact that you have a great-grandmother who is a Moabite, this is the king of Israel? This is the one we're supposed to follow? At which point, one of the reasons why the book of Ruth may have been penned was to demonstrate, yes, ethnically, I'm 1/8 Moabite. But look at the way that my great-grandmother was included. Look at her faithfulness. She was more a faithful Israelite than all these other Israelites, as evidenced by the fact that she was fully. Do you see why the author goes to such great lengths to show us the full inclusion, the full way that Ruth was embraced and brought in, not only by the community of Bethlehem, but by God himself? That God granted her conception. That Obed was the father of Jesse, was the father of David. And, by the way, then we see this genealogy, right? These are the family records of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. It gives us a lineage all the way back, going to Perez, the kingly line, the line of Judah, coming all the way down to David. This is God's plan. And as we think about this, there's just something that is truly beautiful about this. That Ruth, and again, over and over in the book, I've said it 100 times at this point, but over and over, she's described as Ruth the Moabitess. And just again, to sharpen this point as much as possible, if this was written 200 years after, they could have easily scrubbed it. They could have easily downplayed it. But they didn't. Why? Because God didn't want it downplayed. God wanted it right up front. Ruth the Moabitess is now the matriarch of the king of Israel. And of course, what do we see? It doesn't just stop at the end of Ruth chapter 4. Ruth is included in the genealogy of Jesus, along with who? Tamar, along with Rahab, along with the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, along with Ruth, along with Mary. And just think of this for a moment. You've got to believe that this would have been particularly meaningful to Mary. Why? Because we know that Mary would have been treated absolutely horribly for conceiving and bearing Jesus. What was the rumor about Jesus' conception? Well, according to John chapter 8, the Pharisees said, "Are we not right in saying that your father was a Samaritan?" Yeah, we know about the virgin birth. And of course, the rumors about Jesus were that maybe it was a Samaritan, maybe there was some Gentile soldier who came by and impregnated Mary, and she went through with it. But whatever it was, it had to have been a particular comfort for Mary to have found herself in the line and in the same story as people like Ruth and Rahab and others who would have had to have faced and overcome a stigma in order to receive legitimacy. And by the way, of course, where was Jesus born? Bethlehem, right? It's pretty amazing that this same place was in a sense the where the whole story started. And of course, we love this because Naomi, she receives a full reversal of fortune. She goes from empty to full. She goes from bitter to redeemed. It's amazing. Ruth is just a stud muffin throughout the whole story, right? And I mentioned this in the Hebrew canon, Ruth rubs right next up to Proverbs. So that literally you have Proverbs 31, and then you have the book of Ruth, where Ruth is described as, in exactly the same wording, a woman of noble character. In other words, if you want to know what a Proverbs 31 woman looks like, Ruth is your best example. And by the way, many scholars believe that's exactly why Ruth is right next to Proverbs in the Hebrew canon. We change it in our English version, put it up next to Judges because it was the same time period. But in the Hebrew canon, Ruth was right next to Proverbs, and especially Proverbs 31. But then we see, of course, the coming of the kingly line, that God uses and preserves a remnant even in Israel's darkest days to bring about his purposes. And this is the part that I love most of all. He does it all using what? Prayer. In fact, a blessing that Naomi made in the bitterness of her heart. She was brokenhearted and she thought that God had abandoned her. May you just find rest in the house of a husband. Just leave me alone, and may God bless you. God used that blessing, and many others as well. But that was the first domino to bring about this incredible ending to this incredible story. It really is a remarkable book, and of course it just ushers us forward to the coming of David and ultimately the coming of Christ. What an incredible family history, and what an incredible reminder to us to continue to pray, to remain faithful. And also, by the way, I mean, there's tons of lessons just in, who do you want to be? You want to be Poloni Almoni, or do you want to be Boaz, right? There's that lesson as well, all right? Any questions on Ruth chapter 4? Yeah, Taylor. Yeah, I think the answer to that is because it's true. In other words, a critical mindset would say, well, David could have just made this up because he needed a cover. I don't think so. I mean, one, because I believe it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but two, the best defense is the truth, right? And even within the story, does it read like propaganda? I don't think so. How do we know? Because again, if you were trying to do it as propaganda, you wouldn't include Ruth the Moabite. Like, you wouldn't include these details. You definitely wouldn't include the scene at the threshing floor like it is. scandal, right? Risque. Oh, well, she's a Moabite, and guess what? We all know what the Moabite women are like. She's going to show up at the threshing floor at midnight looking to uncover his feet, right? I mean, these are the kinds of details you wouldn't include if you were looking to legitimize. These are the kinds of things you would only include if they're true, but you don't care if they're shared because you know the kind of woman she was and how it ends up. Same principle. We think in the Gospels, in each one of the Gospels, it records that the women were the first ones at the tomb. That is an embarrassing fact. It's kind of like, this is a really dumb example, and it doesn't do any good, but it's like, okay, let's say, no, I'm not even going to go there. No, I'm not. But you can think of various things where if you're telling a story and you are in an embarrassing moment or an embarrassing circumstance and something happens, you kind of scrub that detail to cover it up. They didn't do that with the Gospels. And you've heard this before, but it's true. Women were seen as so unreliable, they could not appear as witnesses in court. Their testimony was seen as illegitimate during Jesus' time. And yet, every one of the Gospels goes out of its way to say the women were the first ones there, the women were the first ones to report it, and they were the ones who told the disciples. That would have been highly embarrassing, but they didn't care because it was the truth. So, those details, and same thing, by the way, of Peter's denial, right? Peter's denial is not the kind of thing you would make up. What's your resume for being one of the leaders of the church? Oh, I denied Jesus 3 times. You don't make those things up unless they're true, at which point the truth helps to prove the point. That's a good question. Yeah. Other questions about this? Thoughts about it? Thank you. So this is kind of a fun thing. So truly, I don't know. There are probably other people who have seen that and noticed it, especially in the form of blessings. But I did actually submit that idea to a conference called the Evangelical Theological Society. It's a scholarly conference. I submitted that idea as a paper proposal because most scholarship on Ruth, I read this book recently that basically said there are no prayers in the book of Ruth. At which point I'm like, I think it's exactly the opposite. So I literally proposed this as a paper proposal, and it got accepted. So I'm going to be going in November to San Diego to present that idea at a scholarly conference and see if other people think it's true. So I don't know. That'll be kind of fun. Thank you for being my guinea pigs to try and help me think through that. But yeah, not necessary, but it'll be good. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Thank you, Lord. Yeah. Yeah. And again, in essence, when you look at the Old Testament, the primary actors, if you will, in the story are Israelites. But what we see throughout the Old Testament is that God is constantly bringing other people in. The Old Testament is never only about Israel. And this is why even in the book of Matthew, you read the beginning of the book of Matthew. Matthew is seen as the most Jewish of the Gospels. At the beginning of the book of Matthew, you have the genealogy that emphasizes who? Gentile women. Rahab, Ruth, Tamar. These Gentile women, Matthew chapter 1, also in Matthew chapter 1, kings from foreign countries coming to offer their gifts to Jesus into Matthew chapter 2. And then by the time you get to the end of the book of Matthew, you have what? Go into all nations to make disciples. So in the Old Testament itself, you definitely have a focus on the people of Israel, but you also have this inclusion of the Gentiles. And if you're thinking about the book of Romans, you should be. Because this is the theme that we talked about over and over again in the book of Romans. To the Jew first and also to the Gentile. To the Jew first and also to the Gentile. So yeah, it's important and it's right there. Other thoughts or questions about Ruth chapter 4? Or anything in the book of Ruth? And It really is. It's such a beautifully crafted story. It's a reminder the details always matter. Every detail matters. Yeah, Grace. Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. And I love this. Speaking of adoption, someone mentioned this the other day. We it's good for us all to remember that we were all adopted into the family of God. I mean, that's what Paul says in Romans 8. We all have been given the spirit of adoption. And the reason why that's important is that none of us ever gets that spirit of thinking, well, I'm the legitimate one, but these are the ones who, man, by the grace of God, they're added in, but I'm the natural breed. No. We all receive the spirit of adoption, but you're right. This is an adult story of her adoption, her grafting in. And the fun thing is, we never even see Ruth's response to this. I mean, think about that. Ruth's married. She has the baby. Do we know how she felt? No. Do we get words from her? No. It's just kind of like Ruth is the one who does her part. And in the end, she receives the honor, right? She's better than 7 sons. But it's like that's enough. It's the fact that she is now fully included is just such the perfect ending that you don't need anything else. It's great. It really is. Okay. Anyone have any thoughts on what you might want to cover next week? We have 1 week to do one thing. My original plan was just maybe to have a Q&A of anything that you'd want to talk about or think about. So what I may do is come up with something that might take 15 or 20 minutes, maybe just like a particular point to emphasize, and then leave it to open questioning. Or if someone has a better idea than that, feel free to let me know. But I just want to say thank you so much. I get so much joy out of this. It really is my favorite thing that I get to do. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for listening, and praise the Lord. The Bible is such an incredible gift to all of us. And so, all right. With that, we're done.